Hey class, this is Mr. Clark. This is Chapter 27, Video Notes, Empire and Expansion, 1890 to 1909. Next slide. First section of this chapter is entitled Imperialist Stirrings. Many groups and individuals began to advocate overseas expansion in the late 1800s, including Albert Thayer Mahan. Imperialism has always been a part of American history. In the first 150 years of American history, even before independence, American history was a history of westward expansion. It's kind of a euphemism for imperialism. Anyway, by the second half of the 1800s, as the frontier was closing, many Americans, including Mahan, who wrote a pretty influential book entitled The Importance of Sea Power in History, advocated the creation of an American empire overseas. And this, of course, was also a time when many nations, especially European nations, were embarked on the conquest of large parts of Africa and Asia. Next slide. Spurning the Hawaiian Pear is the next section. Because of its strategic location and economic potential, Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1898. Americans had been interested in Hawaii for several decades. Its location just about halfway between the Americas and Asia. Its fertile soil, its tropical climate made it ideal for the growing of crops like sugarcane and pineapple. Even cattle thrived on that island. And a group of American settlers on that island helped to engineer an uprising against the native tribal government of Hawaii. And through a kind of a long process, Hawaii was annexed by the United States and became a colony in 1898. One of the first big steps towards overseas empire. Next slide. War with Spain over Cuba is the next section. Newspapers fanned the flames of imperialism and helped to create a mood for war with Spain. The mysterious sinking of the battleship Maine in February 1898 was the catalyst which led to the Spanish-American War. So-called yellow journalism was very strong in the late 1800s. The Hearst and Pulitzer newspaper chains competed with each other to see who could write the most sensational stories of the day. And for whatever reason, Cuba and the mistreatment of Cubans became a very hot topic, and Cuba was one of Spain's few remaining overseas colonies, and many Americans felt a responsibility towards Cuba, and this was highlighted by these newspapers, and it was the sinking or the explosion that took place on the U.S. battleship Maine, in which over 250 American sailors died. This was used as a pretext, and Spain was blamed when there wasn't a lot of evidence about what caused this explosion, but it was almost immediately blamed on Spain. Next slide. Dewey's May Day victory in Manila. Once war was declared, the U.S. Navy steamed towards Spain's other big overseas colony, which was the Philippines, and American Admiral Dewey led an American destruction of Spain's antiquated navy harbored in Manila Bay, and this was one of the few engagements of this conflict that the United States quickly won. Next slide. The confused invasion of Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt became a national hero for his exploits in Cuba with the Rough Riders. Theodore Roosevelt a member of one of America's wealthiest families and most prominent families, led a volunteer force to help, quote-unquote, liberate Cuba from Spanish control, and his exploits were highly publicized. And the Battle of Kettle Hill, for example, was written about, and almost overnight, Theodore Roosevelt became a national hero, and this set the stage for his later rise in politics. Next slide. America's course or curse of empire. The U.S. fought a war to subdue the Filipinos, which killed thousands. The United States acquired the Philippines along with Puerto Rico and Guam from Spain as a result of this war. But the Filipino people expected that they would be granted their independence. That did not happen. And a war ensued in which over 5,000 Americans were killed, and probably 3 or 4 times that many Filipinos died in that conflict that lasted for several years. Next slide. Perplexities in Puerto Rico and Cuba. Puerto Rico became a colony of the U.S., and Cuba became a protectorate as a result of the war. The United States had a quote-unquote special relationship with Cuba, and that would continue all the way up until the 1950s when Castro took over Cuba and ended that relationship. But Cuba was a virtual colony of the United States for the next 50 years, and Puerto Rico was and still is an American colony. So the United States was well underway of acquiring an empire. Next slide. New horizons in the two hemispheres. One thing about imperialism of this period, it was popular, and politicians and the public alike saw a country's greatness by how many overseas colonies they had. And so this made many Americans prideful and proud to be an American and to see the American flag flying over places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Next slide. Little brown brothers in the Philippines. Philippines longed for freedom under American rule. The Philippines would continue to be an American colony until after World War II in 1946. And one of the reasons the United States eventually got involved in World War II was to liberate the Philippines after the Japanese had taken it over early in the war. Next slide. Hinging the open door in China. The United States sought to champion the rights of China in the late 1890s. China was the target of a wave of European imperialism in the late 1800s. The United States issued a statement to the world under Secretary of State John Hay, in which he stated that China should have an open door to all countries. The United States was in no position really to enforce this so-called open door policy, but it showed that the United States was becoming more involved and saw itself as a major player in world affairs. Next slide. Imperialism or Bryanism in 1900. The presidential election of 1900 focused on imperialism. William McKinley was reelected after the American victory in the Spanish-American War. Imperialism, as was stated before, was popular, and the Americans, people, rewarded McKinley and the Republicans for this these overseas victories. Next slide. TR, brandisher of the big stick. Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States after the assassination of William McKinley. Roosevelt became president at age 42, being the youngest man ever to serve as president. He became president through an accident of fate, the assassination of President McKinley. And Theodore Roosevelt became one of our most famous presidents, and his advocacy and support for imperialism really set him apart from almost any president up until that time. Next slide. Building the Panama Canal. Under Roosevelt, the United States acquired the strategic Panama Canal. The Panama Canal and plans for a building of a canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean had been discussed and on the minds of people for decades, long before it was built. A French company started to build this project in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the United States saw this as, certainly Roosevelt saw this as a strategic location and something the United States should take over. And Roosevelt helped to engineer an uprising of Panamanians against the Colombian government, and through some pretty shady dealings, the United States ended up acquiring the control of the Panama Canal and signed a long lease with the newly independent country of Panama. And this became another part of America's overseas empire. Next slide. TR's perversion of the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine was a justification for U.S. imperialism in Latin America. Really, for the first time in American history, the United States began to take an active role in intervening in the internal affairs of foreign countries and so-called protectorates in Latin America. And under Theodore Roosevelt, the United States used sometimes called gunboat diplomacy to enforce American will and dominance in that region. Next slide. Roosevelt on the world stage. Roosevelt became a world leader by helping to negotiate a peace settlement between Russia and Japan. The Russo-Japanese War was a conflict between Japan and Russia in 1904 and 1905, and Roosevelt offered his services to broker an agreement between those two countries, and I believe he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Next slide. Japanese laborers in California. Roosevelt stopped Japanese immigration to the United States through what was known in 1907 through what was known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Racism and economic issues led many Americans to want to limit the immigration of Japanese to the United States. And this is part of the background, by the way, to Pearl Harbor, this closing of Japanese immigration to the United States in the early part of the 20th century. Next slide. And that's it for Chapter 27. See you later, class.